Hello and welcome back to the Zen Embodiment YouTube channel. I've been doing these conversations with fascinating people. Today I have Dosho Port, and I'm very pleased to have him here. He is the director of the Nebraska Zen Center along with his wife, Tetsugan Osho. Okay. And he's the author of two books, Keep Me in Your Heart a While, The Haunting Zen of Dainin Katagiri, and coming out in 2021, The Record of Empty Hall. Very cool. And he's also he also writes the blog, Wild Fox Zen. So welcome, Dosho.
Thank you. Good to be here. Good to meet you.
Yeah, very nice to meet you. Yeah. We always feel like Dosho, us Rinzai folks, we don't know a lot of the Soto folks, but we always go, oh, Dosho, yeah, we like Dosho, he's cool, we feel good from Dosho. So that's really interesting. Yeah. So can I ask you how you got into Zen, please?
Long time ago. Lifetimes, it seems now. Really different world. 1977. I was just kind of in between. I dropped out of college, working in the paper mill in northern Minnesota, and a friend of mine sent me a book. We were kind of wild kids together, reading a lot, but also doing all sorts of illicit activities. And he sent me a book in a brown paper bag and said on the back, "I found it," and with black shoe polish. And I remember my mom's face as she's bringing it into me, and opened it up. It was 3 Pillars of Zen. And it was like just holding the book. It was like, damn, I think he did find it, So just consumed the book. And
Yes.
Then in Minneapolis found that there was a Zen Center, which was a couple hours away from where I was living at the time, but eventually got connected there with Katagiri Roshi. Very different style than the Kaplau style.
Right.
But eventually, and actually had hitchhiked out to Rochester to try to study with Kaplau. I couldn't find the Zen Center.
Really?
It was kind of like a bad dream. There was a snowstorm, and finally I just gave up.
Wow.
Years later, I met him at a American Zen Teachers conference, and he was, toward the end of his life in a wheelchair and Parkinson's, I believe. And, they had lined us up to meet him. They kind of brought him out in a wheelchair in the sun, and we lined up. And when it was my turn, I bowed and said, "Thank you, Roshi. Your book completely changed my life." He kind of eyed me up and down and said, "For the better, I hope." It was for the better. So that's how I got involved.
And what was Katagiri like? What was he like?
Oh, what was Katagiri like? He was like a lot of stuff. He could be very serious. He could be probably more serious than anybody I've ever known. One of the first times that I saw him sitting, in Soto, we sit facing the wall, so you don't see the teacher sitting very often. But, I'd been there maybe or something. And during a sesshin, I had some job. And so I was out of the Zendo, and I could see in the window, it was summer, I could see in the window at where he was sitting, and like evening light, sesshin energy. And I was like, wow, that's it. That's, it wasn't so much that's what I want, but it was just so much like, that's true. That's like a true moment of brightness. And that's how he was. I think he was very well trained in the classical kind of Japanese system and really practiced it and took it seriously. So much so that at the end of his life, he had cancer, and he had been in the hospital for a while, maybe 10 days or something, while they were trying to sort this out. He was mostly, kind of semi-conscious, maybe unconscious most of this time. And I went to give Tomoisa and his wife a break, and he was just getting up for the first time. And I sat in the chair, and he sat at the edge of his bed, and he was nonverbal, and he just kept on straightening himself up like this. And we just sat together for a half hour.
Yeah.
Now, I didn't know if he knew who I was, so I leaned forward and put my hands on his knees and said, "Roshi, it's Dosho." And then he opened his eyes and said, "I know who you are." And he did. That was the sense of being with him, is that he knew who I was.
Wow, that's beautiful. Wow, wow. And you were there for how long?
13 years, and we did this kind of quasi-monastic thing. I worked at juvenile center most of that time as a teacher and quasi-administrator, and we had sitting in the morning, at 5 o'clock, a couple hours of sitting in service, and then in the evening, hour and a half or so, all days on Saturdays, sesshin every month. 4 7-day sessions a year. And gradually we developed the country property that we were trying to get going as a monastery. And had longer periods of practice there, 6 weeks or so. So it was very intense. And it was a Zen center like, I don't think there are Zen centers like that anymore. And, but I mean, at the time that's what Zen centers were in the late 70s and the 80s. They were very intense. And there were people that were very interested in that kind of intensity.
Cool. That's really interesting. Like, because you feel like the culture was so thirsty for it.
I think, the culture and the generation. So it was a lot of the, hippie boomer generation still, and I'm just kind of underneath that a little bit. But so there, I don't really know why, but you could say the culture, but why? I don't really know, but these circumstances came together. And so there was actually, I think, a lot of intensive practice in the US in those days.
Yes. And now, was that right there? That's right there in Lake Calhoun. Is that where we're talking about?
Right. The lake has another name now because Calhoun, it turns out, was some kind of crazy racist bastard. So they eventually changed the name, but I haven't lived in Minneapolis since then, so I'm not quite sure what it is, but it's a native name.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Well, so Katagiri, then you stayed there 13 years. And if you don't want to say anything more about that, what came after that? What transitioned you to other things? Please.
Well, one thing about that is that for me, and working with Katagiri and Soto, wasn't so much of a transition because although there wasn't a koan curriculum, the way he understood what Zazen is as what, as a question mark. And so that, that naturally kind of easily transitions into koan work. And I'd also found kind of a found koan, as we call them, and he worked with me on that for several years. And so it was familiar territory for me. And he also stressed that awakening is important, and digesting the awakening, of course, in everyday life is equally important. So he was different in that way also than I think a lot of the contemporary Soto scene, where sometimes awakening one person, one priest and teacher from one of the large centers says that his center is rabidly anti-Kensho. So that wasn't the spirit of Katagiri.
Wow. Right. I love to look at pictures of Katagiri. He's you see his embodiment, his fullness, his essence is powerful. It's very beautiful. So for me, that you can see, there's that powerful depth is that experience is profound and moving through his life. So beautiful to see.
important experiences for me early on, kind of getting into it also was, seeing him sitting, but I also was over there doing something in the library and heard somebody vacuuming the stairs and peeked around the corner. I don't think he knew anybody was there, and saw him vacuuming the stairs. And he was just like so totally in his body and so totally just vacuuming the stairs that I also was like, oh, that's how you do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. Okay. So, great. How about moving on to Tangen Roshi? Please say a little bit about Tangen Roshi. Can I say real quick, Tangen Roshi, I think, was born in like 1900. And
it must have been later than that. I can't remember exactly, but he was about the same age as Katagiri. So it was probably about 1928, 25 or something. He was a kid where he was a late teenager during the war. So something like that.
That's right. I got it confused because actually I'm misremembering. So Mumon Roshi, Yamada Mumon was 1900, and I was thinking about timeline. And so Tangen, I think, is 28. So I was thinking, oh, he's about maybe 26 or 28. He's about 25, 26 years younger than Mumon Roshi. And but a giant in the Zen world, a huge giant. Please talk about him.
Maybe he was a giant, but he he just was just a complete monk. So he just lived at Bukokuji, and if you wanted to practice with him, that's what you had to do. He almost never traveled. He refused. He actually didn't open his mail, so there was literally stacks of mail in his room. Before email and everything was when I was there.
Yes.
So there was literally stacks of mail in his room not only his mail, but everybody that lived in the monastery, he would take the mail and just put it in his room. It didn't matter.
Yes.
So the first time I saw him, Tangen Roshi, I had just arrived. I'd been at a different monastery, the Soto monastery that Katagiri had wanted me to go to after he died. And so I did, but then after a month I left. I was doing a lot more sitting and stuff in Minneapolis than they were doing on their daily schedule. It was more of a monk's finishing school, really.
Yes.
And so I left there, and by chance, before I was on my way to Japan, by chance I ran into a guy that I'd done a bunch of sesshin with in Minneapolis on the plane to Tokyo. And sat down and started talking to him, and he told me about how Tangen Roshi had saved his life, he said, and that he'd been having a really difficult time, and he'd gotten to sesshin, and Tangen Roshi just kind of helped him sort it. And I was like, well, that's cool. And then just kind of put that in the file. And when this other place, Ryoji, wasn't working, I bailed and went there. And I told them I was coming, but they tried to dissuade me, saying like, yeah, well, if you're going to leave someplace else, you're not really the kind of person that we want here, so don't bother to come. But I, of course, came anyway because I understood the dance. But they eventually I got into eat with the group, and it took quite a while before they actually said, yeah, you can stay. Checking things out. They weren't dumb. But we were standing waiting for Tangen Roshi, and he opened the door and walked in the meal hall and came across the floor to his place to show us where we sit down, and he was just so happy. I was like, this is a guy he's been here for 30 some years at that time. So, just walking across the tatami to his spot is like, he was like, this is so cool, And I think, probably the most joyful guy I've ever met, so kind of a continuous sense of awakening and joy, and very powerful, in Dokusan Sanzen. And Mu, of course, he was just, Mu was pretty much the only koan. So, with some insight, go deeper, go deeper, go deeper.
I have heard that. Where I lived at Sogenji, there were several people who came from Bukokuji later as Tangen Roshi got older.
Mm-hmm.
And, told us stories about him and about Bukokuji, which is a pretty small place.
Yeah, it's a pretty small place. So there's almost no work to do, which is really nice. So we just sat all day, all the time. I mean, we'd have 20 minutes of work, you know, and maybe once every few weeks, an hour or two in the graveyard. And otherwise, you know, there was just very little to do. So there was a lot of open zazen. So it was unstructured in that way, except for he changed it up regularly, but when I was there, it was, you know, morning and evening, and then in between, you know, there were hours of just, you know, open sitting. So it was great. It was the perfect place, and I couldn't really find a Soto teacher that I wanted to work with. And well, Bukokuji is, you know, technically Soto, but kind of in the hybrid Harada lineage. So
right, right. Yeah, well, I've heard you can't really read there, right? They won't let you pick a book up, right?
Right.
That, right?
Right.
It's
right. If you got caught reading a novel, it was a minor violation. If you got caught reading a sutra, it was a major violation. You could get kicked out for reading a sutra or dogen or something. So it was just not. And we had Doksan probably a couple times a day, almost every day, you know, and so it, you know, very intense.
Yeah. Wow. And how long did you stay there?
I was just there a year.
Yeah.
And I was going to come back and sort things and decide what to do, and then away went life. So visa stuff, I had to come back. I was on a cultural visa from Zuioji, so I had to, you know, do something different. And then, you know, I could have stayed. And listening to some of your stories on your podcast, you know, definitely get some monastic nostalgia, and like, oh yeah. Yeah. 3 more years in the monastery at this time would be, you know, that sounds good.
Yeah. You know, funny enough, my previous guest, Bob Schrei, actually went to, he was a Kaplo person, and he actually visited Bukokuji and was going to stay there, but didn't stay too long. But I think there was an exchange there between, because of Kaplo, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, Tangen Roshi was kind of one of Kaplo's seniors, so they knew each other at Hoshinji. I can't remember how long Kaplo stayed at Hoshinji, but quite a while before he went to well, he switched over to Yasutani at some point. But he was at Hoshinji for, I think, almost a decade, maybe quite a long time.
Right.
And Tangen Roshi was like the head of training. So he had some stories about Kaplau that weren't all that flattering that he'd tell especially when there were Rochester Zen Center people visiting.
Wow. I mean, people really talk about Tangen being, hey, you know, this is a Buddha walking around. Very, you know, this is, anyway, I'm very fond of hearing stories about him. Great to hear about him.
He was, you know, Tangen was, you know, huge for many Japanese monks, and you could totally feel it. You know, he was kind of like a rolling top or something as he moved around, and he'd go around with Kyosaku every time he came into the Zendo and hit everybody, and you could just feel that energy just kind of.
Yeah.
The first time I was there, I was in the Gaitan and didn't know the tradition, when to bow and whatever. And he came around, and I was last. Everybody else had gotten hit. So I knew what was coming. So, you know, as he came up, I put my hands in Gesho, and he leaned over and kind of said loudly enough, I'm sure for everybody here, he said, "Oh, no, it's okay. No need to bow now." And so I put my hands down, then boom! But he could hit also like spot on, you know, he could, the best Kyosaku of anybody I've ever received it from. Yeah, you know, it was just an energy exchange. It seems today I'd say no pain. Back then I might have said some pain, but it was just spot on.
Yes, wow. Um, so then you came back and eventually started working with James Ford,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right. Well, yeah. So, I, had, you know, lots of Dharma kind of experiences working with Katagiri and also at Bukokuchi. But, for me, kind of a slow learner or something. I
Yeah.
had the sense that, that there was something unfinished, unresolved, unrequited. And I was, teaching, I'd received transmission from Katagiri, and so I was teaching some. I could give a talk, and I'd always feel like I couldn't quite say it, like it wasn't quite right. And so I kept, trying to find people to work with. And I did a couple sesshin with Harada Roshi, and I'd visited him in Japan. David Chadwick, who,
Yeah.
David Chadwick and his wife were living right next door at the time. And so I spent about a week there and went over and had met Harada Roshi. He was coming here at that time already on, some of the first sesshin he did on Whidbey Island. So it was easier than going to Japan. So I did some sesshin with him. He was, he is, clearly a great teacher as well. I think, that kind of one of the things about that, before we get away from that topic too much, is that I think, and one of the things I hear you say in the podcast I've heard is that you want people to know this, and I think that's good, and because there is something about the American Zen scene that I don't think appreciates the practice in Japan. And some of the practice in Japan, not all of it, of course, but some of the practice in Japan is intensive at a completely different level than what's happening here still, I'd say, by and large. Certainly there's some exceptions and I don't know everything, but that's what I see. And that was for me. I mean, I was a pretty intense guy in Minneapolis with Katagiri Roshi, and we practiced intensively. But when I went into Bokokuji, it was like this is a whole nother dimension of practice, and really important to experience that that's possible. And I think that's one of the things that I carried away from that experience, is that we are capable of so much more than we imagine, and much of our culture now seems to be about acknowledging our limitations, which is important, of course. But there's another side, which is acknowledging our incredible power. So,
yeah, love it. Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, I feel like with these teachers, often, you think, well, I'm really intense, and then you meet them and you think there's a black hole of intensity there, and in a part of they just show us that, oh, I can go so much further into that unknown, and that yes, yeah, I love what you're saying. That's so beautiful. Yeah, yeah.
the first time when I was visiting with Harada Roshi, and Chisan was there, of course. And we were just visiting pretty much, talking. He was just came here having a cup of tea, and he's asking me about American Zen and Katagiri, and just chatting. And then I realized, well, I didn't have much more time with him probably. So I said, so what's the essence of your teaching? And he's, what is he, like 5'2" or something like, and I'm about 6 feet, and we're sitting across a table. And suddenly it was like he was a cobra. He just kind of, and he goes, "You must die now." And then Gashowed and got up and left. Chisan and I were like, "Whoa!"
I know. Oh,
he's a very powerful guy.
yes, yes. Oh man, yes. Okay, so you kept going, and you
Kept going. I did some sashimi with him, then decided I met Daido Lori, and
cool.
I was really impressed with his kindness, really. Although he was kind of a rough guy and known for being kind of a tough guy, a merchant marine. It hadn't been too long before I met him and started working with him, where he'd sit in sashimi and chain smoke in Tokusan. You couldn't smoke in the building, but he'd be chain smoking in Tokusan. People would come in and present mo, and he'd just shake his head and flick his cigarette. And he was very, one of the reasons that I decided to work with him was that he knew the culture that I was working in, and he was very kind of keen in kind of an organizational way, and in addition to the Dharma. So I was able to continue the work that I'd started with Tangen Roshi with him, and seamlessly, really. I'm very grateful, of course, to all of them, but Daido Lori too. And after some time, a couple, 3 years of doing sashimi there as often as I could, it became clear that with his system, and if I wanted to do the system, and I did, I wanted to complete that piece so I could share it also. I would have to be a monastic there for a couple decades, probably, at least 1 decade. And by that time, I had 2 kids, and I couldn't just move to Zen Mountain Monastery. So I took that as far as it seemed fitting at the time, and then eventually was able to connect with James, who was much more flexible in terms of the kind of work that we could do together.
Yes. Right, and to be able to maybe finish up a system to be able to share then.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah, and that system, I think, it's a little different than the system that the Rinzai uses now, modified a bit from Harada Dainin. There hasn't been a lot of modifications since then. I had the chance to talk with someone who was a successor of Bon Roshi's successor, so not from Yasutani, and we kind of walked through the curriculum, in a half hour, just and at least the broad outlines, it's the same except for a few little details. So I had imagined that Yasutani Roshi would have modified it considerably, but apparently that's not the case. The Harada Yasutani curriculum seems to be pretty much what Harada Dainin had developed. So, and that system is found to be very powerful. And, I had this sense of lack of completion, as I mentioned, and, thanks to working with Daido and having, a deepening experience, and then also just the successive refining that comes after that through the koan system that I did with James and other people too, that Melissa Blacker and David Reinig that worked with James at the time. By the time I was done, it felt like, yeah, it's done, so there's a sense of completion that I didn't have, before, which is actually a great relief. And so I am very grateful to James and Melissa and David for helping me through that birthing process.
Wow. Well, that's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting point, having a lot of people go and they do serious training with someone like Tangen Roshi or Shoto Harada, and they have deep experiences, and then, but they're not going to spend 30 years there with that person, maybe, and then they end up not really knowing how to plug that in to something and be able to somehow offer it or be, bring it into the culture. That I just see that over and over and over, actually. It sounds like you had so much homework that you brought to that work, then too, it made it so rich too, right? That's really interesting.
Yeah, so I'd been doing before I started Mu with Tangen Roshi, I'd been doing Katagiri Roshi's version of Shikantaza, And, shikantaza is one of those words that's more of a placeholder. It doesn't really mean anything because it's used in so many different ways. But so Katagiri is what I understood to be Katagiri shikantaza. And so lots of samadhi, lots of settled sitting. And so then I was at a place where with Mu and kind of the forever Mu approach of Tangen Roshi, which seemed just like forever shikantaza. You could tell Katagiri whatever experience you had, and he'd, nod and be happy for you. And then but there wasn't another practice, there wasn't another call on. And what Soto Zen has, and at least I think traditionally had in Japan too, is that the monastic training container could be that post-Kensho refining, engine through the forms of training, and a very intelligent kind of design for doing the day and ceremony, etc. You take that out of Japanese culture, though, it doesn't work very well. And some people make it work. There are American teachers, I think, that do, but they're few and far between. So I think that's a big challenge across the board for how to really live these experiences. And I think the Koan, at least I can report that the Harada Yasutani curriculum is one of these methods that really does help you, make it your life. And
love it. Wow. You have a new book coming out, The Record of Empty Hall, in 2021, and what's that about?
Yeah. Yeah. It's about me sticking my neck out for one thing, again. But so I got into studying Haku, and doing some and study in Katagiri's practice and his lineage. Study is a really important part of the practice, and it was a huge part of what he did. He would sit zazen and study and talk to people and study, and so he was very focused. And it's not like this kind of study. It's study is another one of these words like teacher, that there's all sorts of types of study. There's all sorts of teachers. But study wasn't like reading Dogen in bed, cuddled in with your jammies. It was sitting up, at your desk, but sitting in zazen and being the text, embodying the text, entering the text. So it's a different kind of thing. It was, he has various stories of his teachers scolding him severely. And one of the reasons he got scolded was he was studying Shobogenzo and riding a train. And one of his teachers like, how stupid you are, you can't, if you're studying, study, riding the train, ride the train. So, and that was, he totally took that practice up. I had the opportunity to travel with him, and he once, in the San Francisco airport for 8 hours in one of these, early 80s plastic chairs. And he sat for 8 hours, except going to the bathroom once or twice. He just sat there the whole time, 8 hours. I was just like amazed. And every once in a while, maybe a half hour or so, I was in my 20s, I'd antsy, so I'd get up and walk around, go check the board or whatever, After doing this a few times, I came back and he said, "How impatient you are." Yeah. Compared to him, I was his name means great patience, and he was great patience. I think I went off on some tangent there, so you're gonna have to help me here.
To the book, The Empty Hall.
Oh, the book. Yeah, the book. So studying has always been an important part of my practice also. And I was reading, totally forgot. Age, just wait. So I was studying Hakuin, and Hakuin would be talking about Jutong, and it's a Zen master I didn't really know. Who is this dude? And he has places where he says that Kido Roku is like the greatest of the great, and the kind of completely ebullient, enthusiastic tone of Hakuin. There's been no greater Zen teacher, so, but I didn't know it. So I went around trying to find it. And there is an old translation from like 77 by Hoffman, who's the same guy who wrote the book. The name escapes me right now, but it's like the koan answer book, right? He translated that. So it's terrible, right? But, and those are terrible answers, and it's just kind of just confusing that it's even out there. But he translated this also, and it was in actually an appendix, I think, of the early version of that. I think Sound of One Hand or something is that text is called. I shouldn't even say it because I don't want people looking it up. Going ways. Anyway, I'm glad that he translated that, but I started looking at it, and it's a 77 translation, and he's still alive, but so he was really young at the time, and I don't think he had much Zen experience, so it was like a first draft kind of translation. So glad that he did it, and as I've learned to look up characters, essentially, I've kind of gotten into that quite a lot these past years. One of my favorite things to do is just to be able to sit and look up the characters and see how these things kind of come together and how it might be expressed in English. Yes. I'd already done. I had gone through our curriculum and retranslated it with a student who's better at languages than I am, and so we had that. I noticed the English translations, especially in the Gateless Gate, some of them just seemed funny, like, is that right, do you think? And we used largely the Eiken Roshi translations, and Eiken Roshi was, great literary guy, and he tends to, literary it, so, and the Chinese are usually 4, 5, 6 characters, 3, 4 lines. It's just very terse and pointed. And so got into that process of translating. Don't recommend it for people that are working with their first koans. It's, it's just kind of not that it's an irrelevant. But for me, it was very helpful to dig into it and get a taste of that kind of intelligence in the root of the tradition. Muman, for example, incredible practitioner, deep. You have the sense, I have the sense when working with those translations, that it's like each character, it's kind of slow. He feels to me kind of slow and incredibly deep, just. Yeah. So no spare words, no extraneous expression, just right to the heart. So I was able to find the Chinese version of the Kidoroku, Japanese, and began translating it and then adding little commentaries. And, at first it was at first just a personal project. And as I got into it and shared it a little bit, some people, nudged me to try to get it published. And so eventually I did. And I'm quite happy that Steve Hine, the scholar Steve Hine, wrote an endorsement for it. And so I feel like, because I'm an amateur translator, I've got some experience and practice, but I'm not a scholar, and I don't speak Chinese, so I'm just working it out as I go, based largely on my Zen practice rather than my language skills.
Yeah, so. Right. You've been working a lot online with students. How has that been? It seems like that's part of how it's going these days, especially with the pandemic. How's that experience been for you?
Yeah, so about 7 or 8 years ago, we started the Vine of Obstacles, and which is this online practice group. And I had been meeting with a handful of people online. It was just as the Skype and those kind of things were making it possible, where the technology was, it seemed more seamless. Yeah. And some of them wanted to be able to talk to each other. So we, try to, and they were all over the place, of course. So we developed this Vine of Obstacles thing with a Moodle, and so there's a study component, and Zazen commitment, and then people, and now Tetsugan, by the way, it's Iron Vow. My wife and teaching partner. We're doing it together now. She had been mostly working with the Nebraska Zen Center, but of course we're in the pandemic, and it looks like it's going to be going for a while. And then even afterwards, it's not really clear how people are what we're gonna do in terms of in-person places. So I mean, and it works much better than I thought it would, actually. And working with people online, especially if they're people who have some in-person experience previously, that also works much better than I had thought it would. People can do keyword, koan practice, etc. And it takes more time in terms of the relationship, because it's all verbal, And I imagine for you, working with Harada Roshi, it's like 99% nonverbal, right? So how do we do practice then in this new way? And for a while, we were saying, well, there's things that we can't do. Now we're trying to turn the question and ask more like, well, how could we do them? And maybe not the same things, but how could we, work toward the same end of, and really, the end, well, the process is the Zen wrecking ball, right? So when you start, everything has to be leveled. All the paradigms, including Zen and Buddhism, and everything goes. And then from there, the reconstructive part begins. So I think that it's with some sense of loss and some resistance, because for both Tetsugan and I, we love and have found great value in the body practice of Zen. But maybe that's not going to be how Zen goes forward, and so that's what we're looking at. And I don't know. I think sesshin is irreplaceable. Yeah. People that have some experience, of course, can do solo retreats, and those can be very powerful too. More powerful sometimes. I heard Josan's story. I was very moved by that. But for newcomers, that don't have sesshin experience, how do you get there? I mean, maybe I've got a student now that's doing his first solo retreat in the forest monastery in Thailand. He's doing a Zen retreat, and I had Dokusan with him in the pavilion, and he's got this little mosquito tent, stuff like that, because it's all outside, South Asia. So we're working on, and not having completely given up the possibility of in-person. But I think that even after, like if there's some miraculous vaccination or something that comes online, so to speak, I think we're still going to be, the interest for a lot of people is going to be able to do it this way. It's also, one of the advantages of this is that the people that are interested in, Zen work and Zen work with any particular teacher, like us, teachers, that sense of affinity, it's like few and far between, but they're all over the planet, So then this technology allows this kind of freedom from some spatial limitations.
Right. This big pool, right? You're not just in Nebraska there, or I'm on this silly island, it's like, it's a huge pool. It's so beautiful, actually, in a way,
Yeah.
Great. Well, so just real quick, I think maybe let's kind of start to finish up, but I would like to know for you as a, 2020, why would a young person be interested in this Zen stuff? It's something their parents maybe thought about, you know what I mean, when it was really popular, and now that, why would a person go to Zen? What's the draw of that? What does it have to give people?
Well, I think it has, people can discover who they really are. So what they really are, you know, and stop struggling with that, that trying to stop struggling to maintain the identity center, which is a, futile goal finally to support that sucker because it's going to die. So, you might as well let it go now would be a skillful approach. And a very meaningful life, so a very meaningful life that isn't dependent on a lot of resources, which I think is where we're going also. The need for people to find meaning in life and depth in life without the lifestyle that we've been accustomed to. Yeah. Things don't seem, it doesn't seem sustainable, in many ways. So, so I think, that taste of the fundamental is really important and is incredibly healing in itself. And then also, and those tastes of the fundamental, lots of people experience that just out of the blue, randomly. Zen doesn't have a copyright on that. But what we do have is this process for working through after those experiences. Yeah. Which I don't know of anything else out there like that. There may well be, but I know that this way works. So I think for young people, it's a great time to get involved in Zen practice. And going to your neighborhood Zendo may not be the place to go, because at least in Soto Zen now, Soto Zen largely has grown quite a bit in in the U.S. and I think in generally in the Northern Hemisphere. So there's Katagiri Roshi used to say that in Japan, there's 20,000 Soto Zen priests with Dharma transmission and 3 teachers. And so now in the US, there's, a few hundred, maybe even 400 or 500 now, at least in Soto Zen priests with Dharma transmission, probably about the same percentage of teachers, the 3 to 20,000. So be careful, because what a lot of places are going to be doesn't really represent the scope and depth of the Buddha Dharma. A lot of places are going to offer some meditation, which is a lot like mindfulness, which is about feeling better, which is good, but really doesn't get to the root. And then kind of a community, to hang out together. And as you said in an email, a non-dual philosophy. That's a nice way to put it. I call it the post-Meiji Soto orthodoxy, which is a big mouthful. So I like, non-dual philosophy. So it's a belief system, and it's not about realizing and experiencing it for yourself, which is, why I got into it. That's what I found really compelling, was not, some priest holding up some book and saying, believe this and everything will be okay. Well, that's bullshit. So there's no book you can hold up and say everything's going to be okay. It's just, that's very naive. Yes. So there's sickness, old age, and death, at least. So there's that, actually experiencing this ancient way, and maybe even in carrying it forward to another generation, which is completely dependent on this upcoming generation to do that deep work. And that next generation, it's like, that's when the climate crisis is really going to hit. Who knows what kind of political system we have at that point, so across the board, that upcoming generation is going to need all the resources they can get to lead any kind of sane lives.
Yes. Wow. Really delightful to kind of share some time with you. Really bright feeling from you. So nice. Thank you.
No, thank you. You too. Enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah. Anyway, I got another. I feel like there's like a brotherhood with this kind of stuff, and I maybe Dosho's a little. I can feel. Oh, he's kind of this. He's an older brother. He's a awesome senpai. So thank you. Great to meet you. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, you know, among practitioners, there is that kind of bond, which is wonderful to feel across traditions. And yeah.
Yes, yes. Okay, well, I think I'm going to sign off here. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you to Tetsugan again for sharing you with us for a minute. And I'll talk to you hopefully soon. Thank you so much, Dosho.
You're welcome.
Gosh. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.